Can you turn it up a little bit?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining PHCA for today's webinar, Mandatory Abuse Reporting Provisions of the Older Adults Protective Services Act. I'm Wendy Johnson with the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items to cover, and then I'll turn the webinar over to our speakers today. PHCA offers monthly webinars to members to receive updates from department staff on regulations, learn from industry experts on current trends and practices, and to gain a better understanding of practical application tools to equip you so that you may continue to provide the highest level of quality care possible. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the PHCA website. The webinar has been approved for 1 continuing education credit for PHCA members. Credits will be uploaded to NAB within the next 2 weeks for those who have provided us with your unique NAB number. I'll be sending a link to a quick survey. Your feedback is important to us and our speakers, so please take a moment to complete the survey. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. However, throughout the presentation, please feel free to submit questions using your questions pane on the right hand of your screen, and our presenters will address them at the end of the presentation. I'll now turn the webinar over to today's presenters.
Hi, everyone. This is Denise Getgen. I'm the Director of Protective Services Office within the Department of Aging.
Ray Bianchini. I'm a program representative with the Department of Human Services Adult Protective Services Program. Our director could not be here today. She's not feeling well.
And I'm Stephanie Kirkpatrick. I'm with the Department of Health. I'm the Supervisor of the Complaint Investigation Unit with the Division of Nursing Care Facilities.
So we're just really thankful to have your time today, and I'm really thankful to be here with my 2 colleagues because a lot of times even when we go out and present, we don't have the opportunity to be with older adult protective services, which is what I do, and have adult protective services and the Department of Health all in one place at one time. So I think it's a great opportunity, and I hope that if you have questions of all of us, you'll feel free to ask those. So what we wanted to do was to go through a couple things. One is we certainly recognize that you're very familiar with the Older Adults Protective Service Act, maybe a little bit less familiar with adult protective, and certainly you're familiar with the Department of Health regulations. But what we wanted to do is just make sure under mandatory abuse reporting that everyone feels comfortable with the key definitions, that everyone's familiar with recognizing and identifying abuse, and then, really talk about this mandatory abuse reporting, and really from both the licensing side on health side, Ray Adult Protective Service works within a bureau that also houses BHSL licensing for personal care homes, and so you'll see some of that information in here as well.
And also assisted living is under BHSL.
Okay, so I just want to, again, this is Denise, and my part of the world is elder abuse, and so I just want to share with you why this is so important. Some of you may have seen this before, but we are really seeing an increase in elder abuse, and we'll talk about statistics in just a minute. But just to give you a sense of what's happening not only in Pennsylvania, but also across the nation, for every 1 case that gets reported of elder abuse, there's another 23 cases that never get reported. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the reasons why older adults don't report, or it's very difficult to substantiate elder abuse. So just wanted to give you a sense of really what's happening under the surface. Again, just want to show you why this is important and how this fits into what you do every single day. I've been here for about 11 years. Prior to that, I did inspect nursing homes with health, so I have some familiarity with that side of the world too. I am a registered nurse in the Commonwealth. But just in the last 11 years that I've been doing protective services, we've seen a huge increase. And so this bar graph just talks about, we've gone in just the past 3 years from about 18,000 reports to about 28,000. So it's a 56% increase from just 3 years ago. But every year in the 11 years that I've been here, we see anywhere from an 11% increase to a 26% increase. So again, just, illustrating how frequent we are getting reports and the number of reports that come in annually.
Okay. One thing before I take a look at this slide is I just wanted to mention that I've been with Adult Protective Services just a little over 4 years. And prior to that, about 20, 25 years, I worked with 4 nonprofits that serve people with both physical and intellectual disabilities. So I'm mentioning that because I understand that reporting can be challenging, maybe burdensome, overwhelming at times. And one of the things that I do at Adult Protective Services and have been doing for almost 4 years is I staff the questions line, and I'm more than happy to talk with anyone, help someone understand or answer their questions, whatever they need. So let's take a look at this first slide. So again, I should mention also that the Adult Protective Services Law was enacted by the legislature in 2010. It was not funded until the 2012-2013 fiscal year, which I believe meant it started in July 1st of 2012. Is that correct, Denise?
Funding
13, July 1st of 2013. So the first stat that you see here is that there were almost 2,500 reports received in the first fiscal year, and then in the second, there were about 4,500. In the third fiscal year, a huge increase, 9,168, and then in the fiscal year 16-17, almost 11,000. So overall, this is showing an increase since we first started of 337%. Now, we're not seeing on here the fiscal year 17-18 stats just yet. So.
Okay, so looking at, and just talking about this, so there's allegations that come in the door, so we call those reports that come in. Then those reports get categorized, and really it's like a prioritization. And then some of those end up in an investigation. So of the 28,000 older adult protective service reports that came in, about 20,000 of those were appropriate for older adult protective services to investigate. That was a 15% increase from the prior year. And then of the 20,000 that were investigated, somewhere around 7,000 were substantiated. And for us, that means the older adult is in need of protective services, either now or at the time of the incident. So either at the time of the investigation or at the time of the incident. And again, you'll see the 14% increase there.
Okay, and back to the under 60 adult protective services. I did not put some of these slides together. What does this mean, Denise, the 23%?
So just thinking about this in relation to what I just said as under 60. In under 60, there were there were about 10,000 allegations. Ray said about 11,000 just came in. And then of those, about 6,000 were investigated, and approximately 3,000 were substantiated. And then at the bottom of the slide in the red, you can see what an increase was for each of those statistics.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, just a quick overview. I know you guys are very familiar. I've talked with you guys many, many times, and I know that, locally you're working with your area agencies on aging pretty regularly. So just a quick overview. The law was really written, sort of just thinking about this, logically. It was written in sort of in 3 parts. The first part, late 80s, came out that said essentially it's a voluntary reporting. Anybody who suspects elder abuse can report to their local area agency on aging. There would be a system in place for that local area agency on aging to do an investigation. And then if the older adult was found to be in need of protective services, to put in services to reduce or eliminate abuse. So that's sort of the voluntary reporting. Typically, it's the general public, but other people fall in that, like, for instance, banking, some professionals. And under voluntary reporting, you can be anonymous. So I'm just a person in this world. I suspect elder abuse. I can go ahead and call the Area Agency on Aging, report, and I may be anonymous. The second piece of the amendment was the background check. So they added additional protections for older adults by making sure that people who wanted to work in long-term care settings were background checked. So everybody who wants to work in long-term care gets a state police check. Some people get both the state police check and the FBI check. Those are individuals who reside outside of the Commonwealth or have been outside the Commonwealth 2 years preceding their application. And I know a lot of you guys are very familiar with that process. And then the second amendment to the law was mandatory abuse reporting, which is really what we want to talk about today. And essentially what that says is facilities, and I put that in air quotes because it also includes home health and a lot of what we would call brick and mortar facilities. Facility employees or administrators of facilities are required by law to report any suspected abuse to their local area agency on aging, and it really centers around licensed settings. So that's just an overview of OAPSA, what we call OAPSA, the Older Adults Protective Service Act. So I told you earlier that I work for the Pennsylvania Department of Aging. Our role is to provide oversight and implementation of the law. We do provide funding to our local partners, the area agencies on aging in each county. 52 area agencies on aging cover all 67 counties. So we provide them with funding, regulatory interpretation, technical assistance, quality assurance monitoring, that kind of thing. And then the role of the area agency on aging, this is where the real work gets done, and this is where they come in contact with all of you. So the local area agency on aging is responsible for the intake of reports. They do the investigation, and they are responsible to put in services to reduce or eliminate risk. Of course, they're then the direct provider of local services, and they do their own internal quality assurance as well.
Okay, so one easy way to remember this is that the slides that we just looked at that Denise talked about, there's a direct analogy to the slide you're looking at now, in that the Department of Aging is to the area agencies on aging in the same or very similar way as the Department of Human Services is to our contractor agency, which is Liberty Healthcare Corporation. So DHS is responsible for oversight and implementation of adult protective services. We oversee the reimbursement of funds to the state APS contractor, that is Liberty, and we provide quality assurance and monitoring of Liberty's work. Liberty is responsible. So once a report is taken, and one other thing I should say is when we started 3.5 years ago, when Liberty started and the program officially kicked off, shortly before that, the Department of Human Services entered into a contract with the area agencies on aging throughout the state to provide or to do the intake of the reports for the under 60 population, mainly because all the infrastructure was in place and they've been doing this for 30 years for the over 60 cases. So the supplemental intake that the slide refers to means that once the AAA does the initial intake of the report, they will then send what's called a notification email to Liberty Healthcare's intake. They look at it, categorize it, and then assign it for investigation. And then service delivery follows if the report is substantiated, if the allegations are substantiated. Liberty is also responsible for quality assurance of their own staff, and they are the statewide provider of direct services, investigations, et cetera.
And I think you're all pretty familiar with what Department of Health, and I'm going to speak specifically about nursing care facilities. that we are responsible for the oversight of licensure and certification of nursing homes and ensuring facilities provide adequate services to support the long-term care residents. We have quality assurance functions, and I added here the responsibility of the oversight of the Pennsylvania Nurse Aid Registry. Since we're here specifically talking about abuse and mandatory reporting, that seems to be one thing that some providers are not quite as familiar with as far as what we do with the Nurse Aid Registry and what actions we take with the substantiated abuses. So I'll get into that a little bit later.
Okay, so both older adult protective services and adult protective services have both voluntary and mandated reporters. So anyone can make a report voluntarily. An easy way to understand the distinction between the two, if you're a staff person in a, let's say, a nursing facility, then for the residents in that facility for whom or to whom you provide services, you're considered a mandated reporter. You have no choice. You have to report suspected abuse or neglect. However, if you suspect that a neighbor down the street may be the victim of abuse or neglect, you would not be considered a mandated reporter, but we would strongly encourage you to make that report as a voluntary reporter. So mandated reporter, an employee or administrator of a facility who has reasonable cause to suspect that a recipient of services is a victim of abuse shall immediately make an oral report to the AAA. And just one brief comment, reasonable cause, as I understand it, means just a hint of suspicion. You don't have to know for sure. Denise, any comment on that?
No, just to give you a sense of, voluntary, I think you guys are probably familiar with, but a lot of times we get reports from individuals who may come in contact with people regularly in the community. For instance, recent one, grocery store employee witnesses abuse, both verbal, emotional, and some physical abuse in the grocery store, knows who these individuals are, and decides that they are going to be a voluntary reporter. They call the local area agency on aging, and they can go ahead and report. And again, they can be anonymous. Very stereotypical report under mandated is facility employee transfers someone not in accordance with a plan of care, and neglect or something similar is suspected. The supervisor is notified there could be injury, and supervisors notified, they go ahead and mandatorily report under mandated reporting provisions of the law. So the next slide just really gives you a sense of facilities. Of course, the ones that are written into the Older Adults Protective Service Act are on the slide: dom care, a skilled nursing facility, adult daily living, a personal care home, and then a home health agency. And I want to talk about this for just a minute. So under our regs, a home health care organization or agency is licensed by the Department of Health, or they can be a public or private agency or an organization or part of an agency or organization which provides care to a care-dependent individual in the person's place of residence. And the definition goes on to say that it does include private duty home care providers, homemaker and home health aid providers, companion care, registry services, and IV therapy providers. So when you go back to this slide, it's very familiar with you guys are very familiar with, what's a facility, what becomes a little, and this is what's written into the law, but this second term really does encompass a lot more. And then on top of these definitions that are in both the law and the regulations, the state agencies have said, hey, in addition to these, we want other of our licensed facilities to follow this as well. And so by policy, a lot of the facilities now follow this requirement. Furthermore, and who's an employee? Of course, it's any individual employed by a facility. It does include contract employees who have direct contact with residents or unsupervised access to their personal living quarters. The term also includes person employed or contracted to provide care to a care-dependent individual for monetary consideration. And I hope that I don't, I'm sure I don't have to tell you guys the definition of administrator, but sometimes we do get asked that, and it's really the person responsible for the administration of a facility. It does include persons responsible for employment decisions or an independent contractor, so we do see those a fair amount as well. Okay, so that definition then leads you to, okay, well, what's care? Care is, I'm not going to read all these to you. Services routinely provided, unsupervised, require interaction with a care-dependent person. And then we do give you the definition of care-dependent individual and recipient. And I just put recipient there because I just want to make sure that we understand that recipient is any age. So while Ray and I are talking about older adult protective services, which is 60 and over, and adult protective, which is for individuals 18 to 59 living with disabilities, under these laws, required reporting is any age. So.
Okay. So one thing before I take a look at this slide, I just wanted to add one thing, is that the Adult Protective Services Law also lists certain specific facilities who are considered mandated reporters. In addition, and I don't think, and you can correct me, Denise, if I'm wrong, I don't believe the Older Adult Protective Services Law includes what we call an umbrella clause, which basically says an organization or a group of people that receive public funding and are, I don't have it in front of me, so I'm drawing a blank, and provide care and services. So basically, we've had a lot of interpretations of that, and one of the interpretations is that all medical providers, hospitals, doctors' offices are considered mandated reporters under the Adult Protective Services Law. My understanding is they are not under OAPSA, or?
That's correct.
Okay.
So I'm just going to go back to a slide. Under adult protective, see the second bullet in front of you. Adult protective spells that out pretty clearly. Ours is included under the home health care definition, and that's what Ray's referring to.
Okay.
They have a separate bullet about that it includes the second bullet, and ours is kind of somewhat hidden within the home health care definition. So just wanted to point that out to you guys. Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about, so the first bullet point says all suspected abuse is reported immediately to the local area agency on aging. So what is meant by immediately? First, the facility needs to ensure that the residents and staff are safe and are provided with any care that they need. Second, the oral report must be made prior to any internal investigative activities. And one important point, I think sometimes there is also a requirement to submit a written report. And there is sometimes a misunderstanding that that's what they need to do and they don't need to worry about calling the Protective Services hotline number. The problem with that is the only thing that will actually initiate either an over 60 or under 60 investigation is the call to the 1-800-490-8505 number. So keep that in mind. And and what this is saying is that you need to make that report to the hotline first and then conduct the internal investigation. The report to the AAA, in other words, when you have reasonable cause to suspect that a recipient of services is or may be the victim of abuse or neglect, once you ensure that the residents and staff are safe and have been provided with care that they need, the next thing you need to do is to call the 800 number and make the report. You do not make the report, you do not wait to make the report until the results of your internal facility investigation are completed. Okay, we can go to the next.
Yeah, I just want to share something with you as well, just so you understand the way that we are working with licensing. Our regs say that if we see non-compliance with reporting requirements, we are required then to share that with licensing. And so every month we send a report to the Department of Health, Department of Human Services, about anybody who doesn't sort of follow what Ray just described. So say an allegation happens, let's just use, it's easy for me, January 1st, there's an allegation of abuse, and you make sure your residents safe, they get the care and services they need, and you begin your investigation. However, no report's made. If later, maybe 3 or 4 days later, you say, hey, we finished up and it either is or was or was not abuse, then you report. We're required to report that. And so, that goes right to your licensing. And then whether they go out on that or whether they, cite you on that or whatever, we're just required to report. What they do with that is what they do with that. So I just wanted to share with you that is something that happens every single month, and every single call, we're sort of ongoing evaluation of that.
Okay, so before I talk about the additional reporting requirements, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of what I've said. So there are actually two levels or tiers of reporting requirements. They are the general steps that you're required to do each and every time that you have reasonable cause to suspect abuse or neglect. The first and most important is to make the call to the hotline and make the report to the AAA intake staff. The second is to send a written report either to the AAA, I believe, in the case of OAPSA, or to Liberty Healthcare in the case of the Adult Protective Services law. So Wendy, our host, I am having someone from my office email over to her a guidance document for the Adult Protective Services program that outlines all of these steps, and it's only 5 pages, includes the definitions under the APS law, and Wendy's going to make that available to everyone, send it out by email. So that's the first tier, is call the hotline, and secondly, submit the written report. The second level or tier of reporting requirements is the additional. These are only required if the allegation is what we both call the 4 serious. They are serious bodily injury, serious physical abuse, sexual abuse, or suspicious death. So if it's one of those 4, then you need to call the number on the screen, the 717-265 number. It's referred to as the Mandatory Abuse Reporting Line. And if it's someone 60 and older, you will pick option 2. Someone under 60, you will pick option 3. And you will just leave a voicemail, basically just stating you're making the additional call because it involves one of the 4 series. You don't have to go into a great amount of detail. Once you get this guidance document, it outlines exactly what you need to do. You also need to call local law enforcement, and you also need to submit a report to law enforcement, a written report to law enforcement within 48 hours of calling them. Sorry.
So I like to just sort of summarize that. All suspected abuse gets called to either your local area agency on aging directly or using the hotline number 1-800-490-8505. So all abuse, all suspected abuse gets reported. Then, as Ray said, if it's one of the 4 serious, then you have additional reporting requirements to both, what we call protective services, either over or under 60, and then also to local law enforcement.
And then there's Department of Health required reporting, which everything that Denise and Ray have both talked about, if they're nursing home residents, also has to be reported to Department of Health or home health residents as well. And that's the abuse allegations are reported through our electronic reporting system. And there has been some additions to the federal regulations that include to be immediately reported, not later than 2 hours, if it's abuse and no serious bodily injury, and within 24 hours if it is with serious bodily injury. Now, once you do the initial report, then if it is abuse, in addition, that is where the PB22, the form that's required to be completed, and that's electronic now as well. So and if your facility is in there doing your event report and it meets one of the requirements, the PB22 automatically pops up so that you know you have to fill that in. Also, some additions with the PB22, which hopefully helps with requiring the other reports, but it might be a little later than what's required. But the PB22, one thing that sometimes there's confusion about, there is the AAA report information. You have to put the date and time that you called AAA, and then the PDA, if it meets one of the 4 serious, there's a separate sign-off for when you contacted them with the date and time. And what's recently just been added is if it meets one of the 4 serious, the PB22 will not, it requires you to fill out the law enforcement information as well. So if it meets one of those 4 serious, you know that you have to also call law enforcement, and it will force you to fill that out before you can go further. This is, again, just about the addition in the regulations of the reporting of crimes. So in a nutshell, basically, if there is any suspicion that a crime could have been committed, again, it's that 2-hour change for 2 hours after forming the suspicion that you have to report it, or no later than 24 hours if there's no serious injury.
Okay, this is a summary of what we've just been talking about. So the oral reporting, it's telling you the who's responsible, employees and administrators. On the questions line for APS, I often get questions as to whether or not the report has to be made by the staff person, the individual who actually witnessed the incident, witnessed the abuse or neglect. And what I always tell them is they're sometimes saying, well, we have a system here in our agency, in our facility, where the direct care staff tells their supervisor, who tells the administrator, who then makes the report. Is that okay? What I always tell them is that is okay, provided that the person actually making the report is able to and does make a complete and accurate report of what occurred. So what's required is any suspected abuse or neglect, provide as many details as possible and available. When, again, to reiterate, you need to do it once you're sure that the residents, the individuals are safe, staff are safe, then your next step should be to make the call to the hotline number. Do not wait until your internal facility investigation is completed. You need to do that by picking up the phone and calling the hotline number. And again, just to reinforce, that is the only step that will actually initiate the investigation. Sending the written report will not do it. And making the call on the 717-265 number will also not do it. Okay, so these are the additional steps that are only required if it's one of the 4 serious, which are sexual abuse, serious injury, serious bodily injury, or a suspicious death. If it's one of those 4, then you need to call the mandatory abuse reporting line. That is the 717-265 number. Select option 2 if the individual is 60 or older. Option 3 if the individual is 18 to 59. You also need to notify local law enforcement, and then within 48 hours send a written report to local law enforcement. The written report, there's 2, well, the first written report is going to be made within 48 hours of calling your report into the Protective Services hotline, and that at APS we will accept either the mandatory abuse report form. If you're in a nursing home, we will also accept the PB-22, the initial part of that. If you do incident management reporting in EIM, we will also accept that. I'm not sure about aging.
Aging does accept the PB-22 or the mandatory abuse form.
Okay, and then, so the one thing I will add under where is if the person is under 60, the written report should be sent to Liberty Healthcare, not to the AAA. That's the only difference there.
And just to clarify with Department of Health, the ERS report is, again, within the 2 hours to 24 hours, and then the PB-22, because that would be reported before you do your investigation and complete the investigation. And the PB-22, for us, you actually have up to 5 working days to submit the finalized PB-22 in the ERS system. And I'm just going to throw this in here, too, because recently it's come up a lot. The federal long-term care regulations do say that facilities are required to also report to the nurse aid registry when there's a nurse aid involved with any of the alleged abuses. Here in Pennsylvania, because Department of Health oversees and has the authority of the nurse aid registry, your ERS report actually meets that requirement, because once it goes, the field office gets your ERS report, and if it's a nurse aid, they automatically send it to the nurse aid registry, which is, basically the same people do it. So you don't have to call into central office in addition to making an ERS and PB-22 report in the system.
So we just want to talk a little bit about, when we talk about what is abuse, we just want to go through the definitions and just some brief examples.
Okay. So the definition of abuse: the infliction of injury, unreasonable confinement, intimidation, or punishment with resulting physical harm, pain, or mental anguish. The willful deprivation by a caregiver of goods or services necessary to maintain the physical or mental health of the individual. Sexual harassment, rape, or abuse as defined in the Protection from Abuse Act. Example: a residence care plan requires a 2-person assist for all transfers. A staff member attempts to transfer the resident on their own, and the resident falls during the 1-person transfer attempt, resulting in a fractured hip. Because the staff person ignored the care plan requirements, this would be considered abuse and or neglect.
And if I may comment, that is one of the, again, with the nurse aid registry, anytime there is a situation like this, that a nurse aid fails to follow the care plan, and it comes to us to determine if we're going to take action against the registry, neglect and these failure to do 2-person assist is the most common situation that we're taking action against nurse aides at this point in time. They fail to follow the care plan, and the resident sustains injury, and then we do take action against the registry. Now, with the registry, when we take action, the neglect is not a permanent annotation on the registry. It will be for 2 years that they would not be permitted to work in a nursing home. After that 2 years, if it's a substantiated neglect, they are permitted to request to be reinstated. And there's a couple things they have to submit, and the committee would review and determine. But I think it's important to know, that is the most frequent situation that we're taking action against nurse aides right now.
Yeah, and this is Denise, and I'll just sort of piggyback onto that. I see an awful lot of care plans that either, when we look at our abuse cases and neglect cases, awful lot of care plans that result in falls with fractures. And when you really get down to it, it's either there's no care plan in place, or the care plan's not implemented, or staff are unaware of the care plan as it is. as it's written. And so just, I can't encourage you enough to take a look at your resident care plans and to make sure that staff are familiar with that if something's changed in the day-to-day care for that person, that they should be reporting that, and that they're getting a report every single day. They're actually getting a report in case, so they would know if something changed. And then also that they know what exactly to report, because those are the very common things that we see all the time that sort of start a problem and end up with falls and fractures and that kind of thing.
Okay. What is not abuse? Oh, wrong page, sorry. An incident in which there is no suspected abuse should not be reported to the AAA or the hotline number as a reported need under protective services. To determine if a situation is classified as abuse or an incident, ask yourself, what specific abuse do I suspect was inflicted on the adult? If there is no suspected abuse, then it is not a reported need. It is an incident. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in terms that are more familiar to me. I've done probably 20 in-person presentations together with individuals from DHS's Office of Developmental Programs, where they spend a couple hours in the morning doing a presentation on incident management, and I follow with a couple hours in the afternoon talking about adult protective services and the difference. So basically, what I tell audiences is that what we do not want them to do is we do not want them to automatically report an incident that they've entered into their EIM system to the Protective Services hotline. We don't want them to do that automatically. What we do want them to do is to take a look at what happened, evaluate the incident in terms of the definitions in the Adult Protective Services Law, make a determination as to whether or not it meets the definition of abuse or neglect in the APS law, and then and only then make the report. The other thing I always tell audiences is that we are available at APS to answer their questions related to this, to help to walk them through it, to help them make a determination as to whether or not it does or does not fit the definition in the APS law. Sometimes it's difficult, and it's a difficult judgment call. So there are a couple examples here, which I think will help. A resident is being properly escorted to a vehicle in the parking lot. Because it is raining and the pavement is wet, the resident slips and falls, which results in a fractured hip. So the incident management system requires that be entered. Is that ERS? Is that what you're referring to? Is that ERS?
Our ERS
is the incident management system?
Similar to the
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
I wasn't that familiar with that. Okay, so, however, what's described there, everything was being done correctly, but because of the condition of the pavement, mainly is the reason that the resident fell. There wasn't abuse or neglect here. So that is something that you do need to enter into your incident management system. However, when you analyze this, it's not something that you should report to the Protective Services hotline. What's going to happen is if you do that, then it's going to be evaluated by Liberty Healthcare and by DHS, and it's going to be categorized as no need for protective services. The second example, in the dining room over lunch, one resident shouts at another resident to shut up, and the recipient did not exhibit or report any mental anguish from the incident. So mental anguish can be a little bit tricky. So what I tell people when they, what I tell audiences when I use a similar example is that in the APS law, the law itself does not define mental anguish. So we have some guidelines that we use. So if an incident like this happens, the recipient or the victim, the person that got yelled at, might be upset for a short period of time, let's say, half an hour, but then forgets about the incident, doesn't continue obsessing or talking about it. There's no effect on his or her eating habits, sleeping habits. Then in our interpretation, there is no mental anguish and it does not need to be reported. However, if it's something that continues to bother the person a week, a month later, then maybe give us a call and we can talk about it. Any comments on that?
No, I just say the same things. I mean, we see a lot of, and we get a lot of calls about, hey, I'm calling to report a fall. Let's just use that as an example. And when we say, okay, and we listen to what happened, there's no abuse or neglect. So we say, okay, what abuse or what neglect? Thinking, well, we may have missed something, or maybe someone missed telling us part of what happened. And they're like, no, we don't suspect abuse or neglect. They walk around independently forever. They've been here 3 to 5 months, and they've been walking around they just tripped this day. And we're like, well, you're only supposed to call the Area Agency on Aging to report if you suspect abuse. And if you don't, why are you calling us? And so a lot of times there's confusion about what is an incident and what is an allegation of abuse. And we just want to make sure that everyone's clear that allegations of abuse or neglect, exploitation, or abandonment come to the Area Agency on Aging, and either Older Adult Protective Services takes care of those, or Liberty Healthcare takes care of the under 60 ones. But if you don't suspect abuse, we understand that you have reporting requirements to licensure, and they may be a little different in that way. So we just need to think that through a little bit about what we're reporting.
With the license from Department of Health, we don't need every fall reported either. Again, if it's suspected abuse or neglect, or if there is injury and the resident's been transferred to the hospital due to the injury. But if it's a fall with no injury, no suspected abuse, it doesn't necessarily have to be reported even in our incident ERS system.
And I wanted to add one other thing is, and this question comes up a lot of times when I'm doing presentations to audiences who are comprised of provider agencies that work with individuals, mainly with intellectual disabilities. And they often say they're worried they're going to get into trouble if they don't report it, and that's why they're doing it. And one of the things that the Adult Protective Services law, I can't speak for OAPSA, but it says that provided that they're acting in good faith and they're honestly, trying to comply with the requirements, they're not going to get into trouble. I'm going to give a very quick example of an actual incident that occurred in October of 2016. There was a provider agency that had a sexual assault occur in a group home, and it went unreported for 6 weeks. There was plenty of evidence. It was a resident-to-resident sexual assault. It was not reported either in their incident management system or to protective services for 6 weeks. That's my example of not acting in good faith, and they did get into a lot of trouble. So
this next slide talks about neglect. Of course, there is self-neglect and caregiver neglect, so we're going to talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So self-neglect is the failure of the person to not care for themselves properly. Caregiver neglect is the failure of the caretaker to provide goods or services essential to avoid a clear and serious threat to their physical or mental health. So some examples. Caregiver neglect. The nurse aide fails to turn and reposition a care-dependent individual, which results in pressure sores. That definitely needs to be reported. Another example, the resident rings the call bell for assistance with going to the bathroom. Staff does not respond. The resident tries to get out of bed on their own and falls. That is clearly neglect and does need to be reported. A third example, the caregiver does not show up for their scheduled shift, resulting in the resident lying in a soiled diaper, resulting in, I don't know what that word is, and I can't say it.
Excoriation.
Excoriation, okay. So that resulted in discomfort and possibly more. I don't know enough about that, but that would also be reportable, clearly. It's clearly neglect. Any comments from either?
I just want to say something about neglect. You can see that in our last definition, going back to abuse, it says the willful deprivation. Then when you go forward to neglect, that word willful goes away. Neglect does not have to be willful. It's the failure of a caretaker to provide goods and services. So, you know, if they fail to provide medication to a wing for whatever reason, it can be considered neglect. And so I just wanted to make that distinguish. Abandonment, I think plenty of you probably see people coming into your facility after being abandoned in the community. So we'll talk about that for just a moment.
So abandonment, when a person who has assumed responsibility for providing care for an individual deserts that individual. It's leaving an adult without essential care and or services for an extended period of time. Example, a caregiver leaves work without replacement staff coming on duty to provide the necessary care. Another example, a caregiver takes the adult to a hospital, drops them off at the front door, and leaves.
Can I just throw in here again, I know I keep bringing up the nurse aides, that is part of my passion and my responsibility, but we get a lot of calls about nurse aide abandonment, and if we can take action on the registry based on them abandoning, walking off the job. Nurse aides do not have a scope of practice, nor are they licensed or certified in Pennsylvania. So that's not a reason just because a nurse aide walks off of a shift that we can actually take action against their registry. Now, if something specific happened to one resident because they walked out in the middle of a transfer or, providing care and the resident sustains an injury, that could be a stretch, but that's a possibility. But just that somebody walked off and the facility covered their shift because they quit, we can't take action against the registry for that.
Okay, so we're seeing a lot of financial exploitation, not only in Pennsylvania, but across the nation. So we just want to spend a minute or two on this as well.
So when a person misuses or takes the assets of a vulnerable adult for his or her own personal benefit, the way I interpret the second bullet, and I'm going to let Denise follow.
It can be a single act, just one act. But more often, it's a course of conduct. It is the handyman who's living next door to an older adult, does some work for them, and pretty soon they're moving in with them. The older adult's supporting them totally. Handyman's now the power of attorney, very interested in that person's money. It's more that course of conduct rather than us seeing just a single act like signing a 200-acre farm over to themselves for $1. It's usually this course of conduct.
The third bullet frequently occurs without the knowledge or consent of the victim and deprives them of vital financial resources for their personal needs. And we get a lot of questions about this at APS, and I'd like to just make a comment. So this is a really good way to bait this third bullet point. One of the things that we look at is if taking the person's money or resources or whatever it is to the degree that the person may become homeless or something which places them at immediate risk and significant risk, then it's clearly going to be financial exploitation. Even if it's just a one-time occurrence, signing the house over and kicking them out, that's pretty serious. Although normally we as well look at a course of conduct. And the consent can also, if consent's obtained, false pretenses, misrepresentation, threats, coercion. So the consumer may be sort of giving their consent, but they're being forced to, or there's they don't really have full knowledge of what they're consenting to.
And this is one nice addition when the federal regulations were updated last. Is they added for nursing homes, they added the exploitation piece, because we have a lot of staff in nursing homes that the resident may give them their ATM card, but of course that staff member then takes advantage of that and not only buys them their soda and potato chips for the resident, but buys things for their own personal well-being. So we've been able to use that exploitation. Before it used to be if it was against the resident's knowledge, but now with the exploitation, even though the resident gave it to the individual, they took advantage of that and exploited. So
we just put an example here. Staff member overhears a resident's daughter coercing the resident to give her a checkbook and banking information so that she can pay her own bills. And I think we see this a fair amount, that we see individuals coming in and out of facilities that have people sign things that maybe they're not capable of fully understanding, or are not really in their best interest. So just a thought of something we see with some regularity. Okay, sexual abuse. I think some of you are probably very familiar with this.
Okay, so the Adult Protective Services Law does make a distinction between sexual abuse and sexual harassment. I think OAPSA does as well, right? Okay. So sexual abuse is defined as intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly causing or attempting to cause any of the actions that are listed on the slide. Now, in the guidance document that Wendy is going to make available to you, it expands on each of these actions in a lot of detail. So there's a distinction between sexual abuse and sexual harassment in both laws. My understanding is that both sexual abuse and sexual harassment are actions that do need to be reported to the hotline. However, the difference is that sexual harassment does not require the additional steps, does not require notifying law enforcement, and does not require the call to the mandatory abuse reporting line. The example that's listed here, caregiver inserting their fingers into an adult's rectum or vagina when there is no medical reason to do so, that's clearly sexual abuse.
And if I had to sort of just generally, and please do not quote me sort of in terms of exactly, but generally speaking, sexual abuse involves some kind of intercourse.
Right.
Now, it doesn't have to, because there are some, as it's defined in the crimes code, there are some crimes that fall under sexual abuse that may not include intercourse. But generally speaking, that sexual abuse is a really serious abuse, and the sexual harassment is somewhat less than that in terms of seriousness, if you will.
Okay. And I wanted to add one other thing related to sexual abuse. I know it applies to Adult Protective Services. I don't know, and Denise will comment, let us know, if it also applies under OAPSA. But we also include something that in the law, in the Pennsylvania Code, is referred to as institutional sexual assault. Basically, our legal department's interpretation is that if a staff person at a facility, nursing home, group home for individuals with ID, whatever it is the perpetrator, is actually sexually harassing a resident, of the facility, they're not actually doing one of the actions listed under sexual abuse. They're actually engaged in doing something that would fall under the definition of sexual harassment, would elevate it to sexual abuse, and would require the additional reporting steps. Is that the same with?
Yeah, likely.
Okay. That's all I have to say on that then. Okay.
Red flags, I mean, I think you guys are very familiar with, the obvious ones that are the bruised or unexplained injuries, wounds, pressure sores, decubitus ulcers, that kind of thing. What we'd like to bring to light is, just talking to your staff and training them about this change in behaviors. A lot of times we'll see, or when we interview staff, they'll say, oh yeah, we knew that they were acting different 2 days ago, but they failed to report. So just really having a conversation with your staff, especially new staff, about, hey, if you see a change, we want to know about that. That could represent abuse. It could be an injury that they're maybe just not able or willing to express. But if your staff that are with these individuals every day just see this change, even if it's slight, that they should be reporting that. Of course, the obvious lack of personal hygiene, like our self-neglectors, a lot of times you guys are getting these coming in the door, weight loss, dehydration, changes in financial status, changes in financial habits a lot of times, and new friends. And here's another one where I just would say to just be talking to your staff about who is coming in and out of your facility. And are we watching who these people are and what they do, and are they having people sign things that maybe aren't appropriate? And if there's anything that they have question or concern about, that they should be reporting that. So, we want to talk a little bit about what you can do, and I would just, again, on the same theme, just make sure all of your staff are thoroughly trained in your policies and procedures, because whether you're working for health or Department of Human Services or Protective Services, when we come in and we do our investigations, we're going to ask staff, what is the policy, and are they aware of that? Have they been trained? We'll pull personnel files to see if they've been trained in your personnel or in your policies and procedures. Please make sure all your staff get report on residents every day and not just getting it, oh, they're okay. That doesn't give them the opportunity to say, oh yeah, there was a change or a new order was received or something. They should be making sure that they get a full report on every resident daily. They should know, each resident, that they're responsible for his care plan, and if they don't know, they need to go back and ask or to go find out before, for example, transferring someone, oh, I didn't know that the care plan was changed, or we have always done it this way, I had no idea. And so we see that a lot after someone gets injured, but just knowing what the care plan is or having a reference material, some way that they know what care is to be provided. Make sure that they all know what to report to their staff if someone's refusing care. And I'm not saying that, if someone refuses to brush their teeth or wash their face and hands before bedtime, that's not maybe something that every minute we need to be reporting that. However, if someone's refusing wound care or someone's refusing to eat, we need to be careful about that and making sure that they know what to report. Non-compliance with the care plan. Oh, they don't want to be transferred with mechanical lift, or they don't want to follow a puree diet or something. Changes in condition. A lot of times we'll see, oh yeah, they had a bruise 2 days ago. And I told somebody, but it's not written anywhere. And so those kinds of things can really start a problem where you really hope there is not a problem. And then any concern that they have, anything that makes them uncomfortable, anything that they see that just doesn't seem right. If their gut says that, hey, I didn't like the way this person talked to someone, or, whatever it is, that if they have any concerns, they should have an avenue to make sure that can get to someone who can really look into it. And then, of course, reporting all suspected abuse to the local area agency on aging.
Can I add one thing, Denise?
Sure.
Yeah, since Adult Protective Services is the new kid on the block, so to speak, we're pretty new, 3.5 years. A couple of years ago, we started offering a monthly webinar specific to Adult Protective Services. So it's available. The information and registration is on our website. We are doing one next Wednesday at 10 a.m. I'm doing that with, I'm not sure who in my office, but
this is just wanted to show you the mandatory abuse reporting form, and I just want to call something out in terms of how that form looks. if you look at the top on both the OAPSA side and the APS side, the first block is abuse, neglect, exploitation, or abandonment, which is not one of the 4 serious. So what we want to do is, if it's not one of the 4 serious, then that block gets checked. But if it is one of the 4 serious, then one of the other boxes will get checked. And so we see a lot of problems with this, people just not looking and following that. But please bring that to your staff's attention. The next we want to talk about is what you can expect from protective services. And so, of course, your report will be taken seriously. The report on both APS and OAPSA will be categorized, which for us, just so you guys know, that just means prioritized. Whether we'll go out immediately or up to 72 hours, it'll be categorized or prioritized. That does go from an intake worker to a protective service worker for confirmation. If referrals need to be made, then they certainly will do that. And just so you all know and everyone's clear that when we get a report about someone residing in a licensed setting, we do report that to their licensing. So every report that we get that comes out of a nursing home or personal care home, we do make notification to licensing. So we'll call Department of Health, at the Area Agency on Aging will call Health, or they'll call Human Services. So the report will be categorized and confirmed by a PS worker. Then a comprehensive and unbiased investigation will be completed. Just so you know, we do joint visits with both Health and Human Services, depending on what the allegation is. We talk a fair amount, which is why it's good to have Stephanie here with us. But there are times where it's appropriate for us to be out jointly. We do hold in high regard confidentiality and safeguards for those who cooperate. So we are not allowed to share with you who a reporter is or who cooperates in an investigation. And so, again, there is liability for those reporting in good faith. And we do always protect reporters' identity unless under a direct court order. If an allegation is confirmed that, yes, this case was substantiated, meaning the older adult or adult is in need of protective services, we can offer assistance services offered to both the consumer and or their family to reduce or eliminate risk. And just another aside, the AAA or DHS contractor must review, which is Liberty, must review and approve a care plan created or modified due to a report abuse. So say you put in a certain kind of care plan. I mean, we need to have a discussion because it can't be that we're not comfortable with something and then someone and maybe licensing is. Somehow we need to work that out and make sure that residents are for us, it's very concerning when we start to see there's a serious allegation of abuse and the staff member is moved to another floor. Well, that sometimes is concerning. And of course, I know that the devil's in the details with all these cases, but we just need to have some conversations about that. If there is a plan of supervision for staff who may be involved in this, we do have to approve that as well. And we talked earlier about you can report to the local area agency on aging directly, and I can't encourage you enough to get to know your local area agency on aging, not just because you are a professional in this field, but also personally. I mean, I know a lot of you are in the healthcare sort of field, and people will just assume, hey, you know everything about everything, and we just can't. And so if you got to know your local area agency on aging and what services can help older adults in your community, I think that'd be helpful both professionally and personally. Then, of course, if you want to report using the 1-800 line, we did provide for you that number as well. Now, just a sense of how that works, if I call from my office landline in Dauphin County, it'll go to Dauphin County Area Agency on Aging. If I call from my home phone, the landline, it'll go to York County Area Agency on Aging and so forth. So the line will try to default and put you to the closest area agency on aging who can help. There is a default, so if you end up with another county, sometimes there is default. If it can't recognize where you're calling from for whatever reason, it will default you to another county, including Allegheny County. So whoever answers that line, please give them the information and they'll get it where it needs to be. We wanted to make sure that you had our direct contact information. Of course, Laura couldn't be here today, but certainly if you have questions, you can call Ray or Stephanie or myself.
And I'll be happy to provide my direct line, because I do staff that line, and if I'm not in the office, it's transferred to someone else. But it's 717-736-7116, and my first name's Ray, last name is Bianchini. It's Bianchini. I'll be happy to talk with you.
So that's the information we wanted to present to you, and I guess I'll just see if there's any questions.
Yes, thank you, Denise, Stephanie, and Ray. That was great information that you shared with us today. And at this time, we are opening up the question and answer portion. I do have 2 questions already in, but if anyone else on the line has any questions, please type them into the question box on the right hand of your screen on the GoToWebinar pane. The first question that we have is, please remind us what PDA stands for.
Sorry about that. Pennsylvania Department of Aging.
Okay, I'm sure, yep, that could have a lot of different meanings to it. So, Pennsylvania Department of Aging, thank you. The next question that we have is, the question reads, I saw for nursing homes, it is a 2-hour window to report changes. Is this time frame the same for personal care homes and assisted living?
This is Ray from APS and Bureau of Human Services Licensing. I do not know the answer to that. We do work some with our licensing, but I don't have the level of detail regarding their regulations. I will get an answer from licensing and get it to Wendy.
Okay, I appreciate the
question back. We just want to make sure that people understood that 2-hour rule. Stephanie, can you just talk about that for just a minute?
It's 2 hours when the suspected abuse, when you have a suspicion of abuse. If there is injury, you have 2 hours to report it in the ERS system. If there is no injury, you have up to 24 hours to file the report in ERS.
Okay, we just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have another question that's popped in. I'll read it. The infliction of injury, unreasonable confinement, intimidation, or punishment with resulting physical harm, pain, or mental anguish. It doesn't really sound like a question, does it?
No, it's that's the first bullet in the abuse definition. So okay. I'm not sure what people, but if somebody wanted to make that clear, we'll try to answer it, what the question is.
Okay. It does say, will you please spend some time describing this? I guess go into a little more detail on it.
Sure. That's the first sort of bullet about what is the definition of abuse. And basically what it's saying, I think the first part, the infliction of injury, I think everybody's pretty clear on what that is. Then unreasonable confinement, sometimes we hear restraint still, despite, I think sometimes I've been a nurse for a long time that we're past the days of restraint, but I think in some settings that still is happening. And then with intimidation or punishment, and a lot of times we do see that where someone's being intimidated for things like call bell usage or they're being punished in some way, and it results in this physical harm, pain, or mental anguish. Now, I think you guys are pretty clear on what's physical harm or pain. It's the mental anguish one that gets people tripped up a lot. And I would just say, again, looking for changes in behavior. So, even when I was inspecting nursing homes, we would look for things like, was this person, did they experience some kind of infliction of injury, unreasonable confinement, intimidation, or punishment? And then is there mental anguish? So maybe they'd have a policy in place that if there's an incident that occurred, they'd check them for the next 3 to 5 days, on every shift, trying to talk to them about, are they experiencing any mental anguish? The other thing is, some people will say, I was so scared or so embarrassed that I'm not going to activities anymore, or I'm not going to eat in the dining room anymore, or I'm not going to ring my call bell. I think that those kinds of things start to go towards this mental anguish. And so we just need to be careful about, sort of assessing that after an incident.
Okay, thank you for that. We do have another question that's come in. If a staff member yells at a resident and when it is reported to management a few days later by another family and the resident who was yelling at does not remember, do you still report verbal abuse?
If the facility suspects abuse, they are required by law to report. So I guess if I just heard only what you just described to me, I would say report. And while I understand, I mean, it's always about, does the facility suspect abuse? And so we want to be careful about that because, you know, when we come in and your licensure comes in, they're going to be looking at what do you consider, what does your policy say, you know, what does that say you're going to do? And so making sure that staff are familiar with that. But generally speaking, again, I'll just repeat, the devil's in the details. And I would just say that in that instance, if somebody said to me, a resident yelled at so-and-so, I would have reason to suspect abuse. I would go ahead and report that, not knowing any other details.
Right.
I get, if I can make a comment, I get a lot of questions related to similar situations, and what I normally say is, I need to know a lot more detail. Tell me more about what happened, and then talk about it, because the devil is in the details.
Okay, great. Okay, here's a further comment. Staff yelled at resident, and that would be required. And then the next comment is, and that would be required the police to be notified as well.
No.
Mm-mm. Only one of the police required report is only if one of the four serious.
Which are?
Go ahead.
Which are serious injury, serious bodily injury, sexual abuse, or a suspicious death. That's the only time that it's required to notify law enforcement.
Or suspected crime.
Yeah, if there's a crime in addition on the health side. But so yelling, you know, just without knowing anything else, I would say no to that, no police notification. That's something that may be reported to protective services, maybe some kind of incident, but not police involvement.
Sure. Okay.
Unless the facility policy is that they report every allegation of abuse to the police. And I've seen some facilities have that policy.
Okay, this was really great information today. I don't see any more questions, but do know that I will be sending the contact information for our presenters today. So if you do have other questions, you can feel free to reach out to them directly. Again, we're going to be sending a survey following the webinar. We'd love for you to respond, and so we can get some feedback. And we want to thank our speakers, Denise, Stephanie, and Ray, again, for presenting on this topic. We do have Denise coming back to our ALPC Summit in March of 2019, along with Jackie Rowell. So registration just opened for it this week. Check our website, phca.org, for more information, and you should start seeing some registration flyers hitting your mailboxes within the next week or so. So check that out. It's going to be a great program that day. We have a lot of good speakers lined up and great topics. So we'll look forward to seeing people there. And don't forget, we do have more webinars coming up into the new year. We're going to take a little holiday break and then come back in the new year with a full schedule. So stay tuned for that and look for more information for more webinars. Again, thank you to our speakers, and we'll catch you. Have a great holiday season, everybody, and we'll touch base in 2019.